The story does not begin with an answer, or even with a clear question. It begins with a feeling, something subtle and persistent, like a thought that never fully settles. Across generations, across cultures, across quiet moments when the world slows down, one idea continues to return. Are we truly alone, or has something been kept just beyond reach? It is not asked loudly. It does not demand attention. Instead, it lingers, waiting in the background, appearing again whenever certainty begins to feel incomplete. For most, the question passes quickly, replaced by the routines of daily life. But for others, it stays. It grows quietly, shaped by fragments that refuse to disappear. A report mentioned once, then never again. A testimony that feels too consistent to ignore, yet never fully confirmed. A document released years later, carrying just enough detail to raise new questions, but never enough to settle them. These fragments do not form a clear picture. They do something far more subtle. They create a pattern that can be felt before it is understood. And within that pattern, there is a silence that feels deliberate. Not empty, not accidental, but carefully maintained. It appears in missing records, in statements that shift over time, in moments where information seems to stop just short of revealing something more. No single piece is enough to prove anything on its own. That is what makes it easy to dismiss. And yet, when they are placed together, something begins to take shape. Not a conclusion, but a possibility. One that remains just out of reach, as if it were never meant to be fully seen all at once. Throughout history, information has rarely moved freely when it carries weight. Governments have classified, institutions have filtered, and authorities have decided what should be known and what should remain distant. This is not unusual. It is part of how systems protect stability. But it also creates a quiet question. What happens to the information that does not fit within what can be easily explained? Sometimes it is studied in private. Sometimes it is stored where few will ever look. And sometimes it simply fades from view, not because it was resolved, but because attention moved elsewhere. Over time, this process creates gaps. Not obvious gaps, but subtle ones, where something feels incomplete without anyone being able to explain why. It is within these gaps that the question continues to exist. Not as a demand for answers, but as a quiet awareness that something may be missing. The absence itself begins to feel meaningful, as if it carries its own kind of evidence. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, doubt begins to take shape. Not wild speculation, but a careful reconsideration of what has been accepted without question. There are moments when this awareness becomes impossible to ignore. A detail that does not align, a timeline that feels adjusted, a voice that speaks briefly, then disappears. Each one, small on its own, yet together forming something that cannot be easily dismissed. It does not provide clarity. It does something more unsettling. It suggests that clarity may exist somewhere else. And so the question remains. Not louder, not clearer, but deeper. It settles into the spaces between what is known and what is assumed, waiting without urgency, yet never fully leaving. If something has been hidden, it has not been erased. It has only been kept out of reach, just far enough to remain uncertain. And in that uncertainty, a final thought begins to form, quiet but persistent. What if the silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of something held just beneath awareness, waiting to be noticed, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as if the story itself has been unfolding in fragments, leading back to a beginning that has yet to be fully seen, where the first signs may have already. Long before the question took shape in quiet conversations, there were moments when something unusual appeared without warning, then vanished before it could be understood. These moments were not imagined, and they were not ignored. They were recorded carefully, often by individuals trained to observe with precision, pilots scanning empty skies, radar operators tracking objects that should not have been there, scientists noting signals that did not follow expected patterns. At first, these events were treated as anomalies, small deviations in systems designed to measure the predictable. A radar return that moved too quickly, then disappeared without trace. A light that shifted direction in ways that did not match any known aircraft. A signal that repeated, not randomly, but with a structure that suggested intent, then faded as suddenly as it began. Each event, on its own, could be explained away, or at least set aside, but they did not remain isolated. They began to accumulate. In quiet control rooms and distant observation posts, logs were filled with details that did not quite align. Times, coordinates, velocities, data that should have formed clear conclusions, instead created deeper uncertainty. These reports were not dismissed outright. In many cases, they were studied with care, examined by those who understood the systems better than anyone else. Questions were asked, comparisons were made, patterns were considered, and then something changed. The discussion did not continue openly. The reports did not disappear entirely, but they seemed to lose their momentum. Files were archived, sometimes reclassified, sometimes simply left without further explanation. The events remained documented, yet the conversation around them grew quieter, as if the act of recording had been allowed, but the act of understanding had been gently paused. This silence did not feel accidental. It appeared again and again, following the same rhythm. An observation would emerge, drawing brief attention, followed by careful analysis. Then, just as the possibility of a larger conclusion began to form, the process would slow, and the information would settle into storage, incomplete but preserved. Not denied, not confirmed, but placed somewhere in between. Over time, this pattern became more difficult to ignore than the events themselves. Because within these early records, there were details that resisted simple explanation, objects that accelerated beyond known limits without visible propulsion, movements that suggested control, yet lacked any recognizable origin, signals that seemed structured, but could not be translated or traced. These were not dramatic claims, but precise observations, recorded by individuals who understood exactly what they were seeing and what they were not. Still, no clear conclusion was ever presented. Instead, the records remained fragmented, scattered across time and location, each one containing a small piece of something larger. And yet, no one publicly assembled those pieces. No official narrative emerged to connect them, to explain why similar events were appearing in different places under different conditions, yet carrying the same underlying mystery. It was not denial. It was something more controlled. A quiet acknowledgement, followed by silence. And within that silence, a question began to take on a new shape. Not whether these events occurred, but why they were handled in such a consistent way. Why they were studied with seriousness, yet never brought into full view. Why the process seemed designed not to eliminate the mystery, but to contain it. As the years passed, the early signals remained where they had been placed, recorded, archived, and largely forgotten by those who were never meant to look closely. But they did not lose their significance. If anything, they gained it, simply by existing without resolution. Because if these were the first signals, if these were the earliest moments when something stepped briefly into view, then they were not isolated incidents. They were the beginning of something that had already been in motion. Something that did not announce itself, but allowed itself to be seen, just long enough to be recorded, and then just long enough to be set aside. And as the pattern becomes clearer, another thought begins to emerge, quiet but difficult to ignore. These signals were not mistakes. They were not random. They followed rules that were never explained, appearing within reach of observation, yet always just beyond understanding. Which raises a deeper question, one that lingers beneath everything that has been recorded so far. If something could be detected, studied, and then quietly removed from discussion, then perhaps the real mystery is not what was seen, but what happened next when one event refused to remain contained, and for a brief moment forced everything into the open before it could be hidden again. For a long time, the pattern held. Observations were made, recorded, studied, and then quietly set aside. Nothing escalated beyond controlled attention. Nothing forced a public response. The system, whatever it was, remained stable. Until, at some point, something happened that did not follow the expected path. It began without warning, as these things often do. A report, at first no different from the others. An object seen under unusual circumstances, behaving in ways that resisted simple explanation. But this time, the reaction did not remain contained within quiet channels. It moved faster. It reached further. And for a brief moment, it became visible. The response was immediate. Not gradual analysis, not cautious observation, but action. Personnel were mobilized with a speed that suggested preparation rather than surprise. Areas were secured. Access was restricted. Communication shifted from routine documentation to something far more controlled. The tone changed, even if the details remained unclear. What made this Ghutna different was not only what occurred, but how quickly it disrupted the established rhythm. Information appeared suddenly, carried through official channels, then just as quickly began to change. Initial statements suggested one version of events, direct and unambiguous. Shortly after, those statements were revised, softened, or replaced entirely. What had been described with clarity became uncertain. What had been acknowledged became questionable. The narrative did not disappear, but it shifted, as if being carefully adjusted in real time. This change was subtle but unmistakable, because behind the public revisions, something else could be sensed. The internal response, the urgency, the coordination, the speed did not align with the calm tone that followed. It suggested a level of significance that was never fully expressed. Those who were directly involved appeared to understand more than what was being said, yet that understanding never reached beyond the immediate circle. Witnesses became part of the process. Some accounts were recorded in detail, then quietly limited in their distribution. Others were simplified, reduced to fragments that could be more easily managed. In certain cases, individuals who had been present found their experiences reframed, not denied, but altered just enough to fit within acceptable boundaries. The event remained acknowledged, but its meaning became less clear. This was not chaos, it was control. A narrative was being shaped, not by removing the Ghutna entirely, but by guiding how it would be remembered. Details were allowed to exist, but not to connect. Questions were permitted, but not to expand beyond a certain point. The result was something incomplete, a story that could be told without ever reaching its full form. And yet, despite this effort, something remained. A trace of the original moment, a sense that what had happened carried more weight than what was ultimately presented. The pattern had been interrupted, even if only briefly. And in that interruption, a glimpse of something larger had been revealed. It did not last long. The system reasserted itself, the silence returned, and the Ghutna settled into the same quiet space as the others, documented but distant, known but not understood. The pattern continued, as if nothing had changed. But something had, because this was not just another observation quietly archived. It was a moment where the usual process failed to fully contain what had occurred. A moment where the response itself became part of the mystery, revealing more through its urgency than any single detail could explain. And that realization does not fade easily. It lingers, creating a new kind of question. Not about the Ghutna alone, but about everything that may have followed the same path without ever reaching that level of visibility. If one event required such a reaction, such careful management, then it cannot exist in isolation. It suggests something else entirely, that this was not the first encounter, only the first that could not be completely hidden. By the time an event fades from public attention, it rarely vanishes all at once. It does not dissolve into nothing, nor does it leave behind a clear boundary where knowledge simply ends. Instead, it changes form. It becomes quieter, less visible, and gradually more difficult to recognize as something that once demanded explanation. This process is not as mysterious as it first appears. In many cases, it follows systems that already exist, built not to hide truth entirely, but to manage how it moves. Information, especially when it carries uncertainty or consequence, is rarely allowed to remain unrestricted. It is organized, categorized, and distributed with intention. And within that structure, something subtle begins to happen. Details become separated. A single event, no matter how significant, can be broken into parts. A report filed in one place, a technical analysis stored somewhere else, a witness account recorded under a different classification. Each piece remains intact, each one preserved, yet none of them are easily connected. To anyone looking from the outside, nothing appears missing. The records exist, the data is there, but the complete picture is no longer visible. This is where information begins to disappear without ever being erased. It is not removed, it is divided. Within structured systems, access is rarely universal. Information is shared based on relevance, clearance, and necessity. This creates layers, where individuals can understand their specific part in detail, but remain unaware of how it fits into something larger. No single person holds the entire context. No single document contains the full narrative. And because of this, the story itself becomes fragmented, existing across boundaries that are rarely crossed. This method does not require secrecy in the dramatic sense. It does not depend on silence alone. It depends on organization. Because when information is carefully distributed, it becomes self-contained. Each piece can be understood independently, without raising questions about what might be missing. And over time, the absence of connection begins to feel normal, as if the fragmented view is the complete one. Occasionally, fragments return to the surface. Documents are released, records are declassified, and for a moment, something that was once hidden becomes visible again. But even then, the process does not fully reverse. What is revealed often carries gaps, sections removed, details obscured, context reduced. The information appears complete at first glance, yet something about it feels unresolved, as if it refers to parts that are no longer present. This creates a different kind of uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of something unknown, but the uncertainty of something partially known. A document that hints at a larger report that cannot be found. A statement that references events without describing them fully. A timeline that begins in the middle, without showing where it truly started. These are not errors, they are traces. And within those traces, a quiet realization begins to take shape. What is visible may not be false, but it may not be whole. It may represent only what remains after something else has already been removed or separated. This idea does not announce itself loudly. It settles slowly, almost gently, as the audience begins to understand that disappearance does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means distance. Sometimes it means division. And sometimes it means that the full picture exists, but cannot be seen from any single point of view. The effect is subtle, but powerful. Because once information is divided in this way, it becomes difficult to reconstruct. Even when fragments are found, even when patterns begin to emerge, there is always the possibility that something essential remains elsewhere, beyond reach. Not hidden in the traditional sense, but placed within a structure that prevents it from being fully assembled. And this raises a deeper question, not just about what has been concealed, but about how effectively it can remain that way. If information can disappear without being erased, if it can exist in pieces without ever forming a complete whole, then the mystery is no longer limited to what is unknown. It extends to the system itself. A system where truth is not removed, but carefully arranged, ensuring that it can be seen, but never fully understood, leaving behind only fragments that point towards something larger, something just beyond connection, where the next step is not to search for more information, but to consider who within that system may have seen enough to recognize what the fragments cannot reveal alone. Not all silence is empty. Sometimes, it is shaped by voices that came close to saying something more. Voices that carried fragments of experience, but never formed a complete account. These were not unknown figures speaking from the margins. Many were trained observers, individuals whose roles required precision, discipline, and clarity. Pilots who trusted what they saw in open sky. Officials who handled information meant to remain controlled. Researchers who worked with data that resisted simple explanation. Their words exist, but they rarely arrive in full. Instead, they appear in moments. A statement given with care, then softened later. An interview where certain details are described with confidence, while others are left deliberately vague. A report that includes precise observations, yet avoids drawing conclusions that might extend beyond accepted limits. There is no single account that reveals everything. But there is a pattern in how these accounts unfold. It often begins with certainty. An individual describes what was seen, what was measured, what could not be explained at the time. The language is direct, grounded in experience. There is no exaggeration, no attempt to convince. Only a quiet insistence that something occurred which did not fit within known understanding. For a brief moment, the clarity feels complete. Then, something shifts. The same voice returns, but the tone has changed. Words become more careful, more measured. Certain details are reconsidered, reframed, or set aside. The certainty that once defined the account becomes less visible, replaced by ambiguity. It is not a full retraction. It is something subtler, a narrowing of what can be said without consequence. This pattern appears again and again. And yet these voices do not disappear. They remain present, but their credibility begins to move. Not removed entirely, but adjusted. A respected observer becomes someone whose account is considered uncertain. A clear statement becomes an opinion rather than a fact. The focus shifts away from what was described and toward the individual who described it. Questions are raised, not about the event, but about perception, interpretation, or memory. This is not an act of silencing in the traditional sense. It is a redirection. The voice is still there. It can still be heard. But the weight it carries is altered, just enough to prevent it from shaping a larger understanding. Over time, the account remains, but its influence fades, not because it was disproven, but because it was repositioned. Within this process, something becomes clear. Silence does not always require force. It can emerge through subtle shifts in attention, through the careful adjustment of how information is received, rather than whether it is allowed to exist. A voice can speak, and still remain unheard in the way that matters most. This creates a quiet tension. Because within these accounts, there are moments where something almost emerges, a detail that feels too specific to be imagined, a hesitation that suggests something held back rather than forgotten, a pause that carries more meaning than the words that surround it. These are not dramatic signals. They are small, easily overlooked, yet they remain consistent. They suggest that what was shared may not be complete, that behind the measured language, behind the careful phrasing, there may be more that was never fully expressed. Not because it could not be said, but because it reached a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. And that boundary is rarely visible. It does not announce itself. It is understood without being defined, shaping what can be spoken and what must remain implied. Those who approach it seem to recognize it instinctively, adjusting their words just before they reach something that feels too clear. The result is a collection of voices that feel connected, even when they remain separate. Each one offers a fragment, a glimpse into something that resists full disclosure. Each one stands on its own, yet none of them form a complete narrative. And within that incompleteness, a deeper question begins to take shape. If these individuals only revealed what they could, if their words stopped just short of something more, then what exists beyond that point? What remains unspoken, not because it is unknown, but because it was never meant to be fully shared? The fragments are there, the voices remain, but the full picture does not. And as these accounts begin to settle into a pattern, another realization begins to form. Quiet, but persistent. If each voice only carried part of the truth, then the truth itself may not exist in any single place, but somewhere beyond them all, waiting in a space where the fragments might finally connect, if only that space could be reached. There are moments, buried deep within archives and forgotten systems, where something appears that does not quite belong, not because it is out of place in an obvious way, but because it seems to reference something else, something that cannot be found, a file that points to another file, a report that mentions an event with no corresponding record, a line within a document that suggests a larger context, yet offers no path to reach it. At first, these details are easy to overlook. Archives are vast, imperfect, shaped by time and human error. Misfiled documents are not unusual. References can be incomplete. Systems can lose track of their own contents. But every so often, a pattern begins to form, one that feels too precise to be accidental. Not chaos, but something more deliberate, hidden within the ordinary structure of record keeping. It begins with small inconsistencies. A document carries a classification that does not match its content. A report number appears in sequence, yet the files before and after it exist, while it does not. A reference appears multiple times across unrelated records, always pointing towards something that remains absent. These are not dramatic discoveries. They are quiet irregularities, noticed only by those who look long enough to recognize when something is missing in a way that feels intentional. Over time, these irregularities begin to connect. Not directly, not in a way that forms a clear map, but in a way that suggests repetition. The same types of gaps appearing in different places. The same kinds of references leading nowhere. The same subtle sense that something once existed within the system, but cannot be reached through it anymore. This creates a different kind of presence. Not the presence of information clearly stored, but the presence of something implied, a record that exists only through what points toward it. A document that can be felt through its absence, through the space it leaves behind in places where something should be complete. And then, occasionally, something slips through. A file appears where it was not expected, not in the primary system, not in the place where it would normally be stored, but somewhere else entirely. Within unrelated archives, within collections that do not seem connected, within contexts that make no immediate sense. These are not complete records. They are fragments, partial glimpses, pieces that seem to have been separated from something larger. They should not be there, and yet, they are. The question is not how they appeared, but why they exist at all. Because if something was meant to be removed, it could have been erased. If something was meant to be hidden, it could have been secured within restricted systems. But these fragments exist in a different way. Not erased, not fully hidden, but displaced. As if they were moved rather than deleted. This possibility changes the nature of the mystery. Because it suggests that the most important information may never have been stored in places designed to be accessed. That what remains visible is only what was allowed to stay within reach, while something else was placed outside the expected structure entirely. Not lost, but relocated into spaces where it would not be recognized for what it is. This is where the unease begins to deepen, because it means the system itself may not be incomplete by accident. It may be functioning exactly as intended, presenting a version of reality that appears whole, while quietly separating what does not fit within it. The records that remain are not false, they are simply not everything. And the ones that matter most may not exist where anyone is looking. They may exist somewhere else, scattered, embedded, hidden in plain sight within unrelated contexts, waiting not to be discovered directly, but to be recognized through the patterns they leave behind. Not as a complete archive, but as fragments placed just far enough apart to avoid connection. And that realization does not bring clarity. It brings distance. Because if the records are not missing, if they were never truly erased, then the truth has not disappeared. It has only been moved, placed beyond the boundaries of expectation, where it remains intact but unreachable, leaving behind only traces that suggest something far larger exists, just outside the system. Waiting in a place no one thinks to search, where the next step is no longer about finding records, but about understanding what those hidden fragments were trying to describe all along. At first, each encounter seemed to stand alone, separated by distance, time, and circumstance. A sighting in one region carried no obvious connection to another, thousands of miles away. A report filed decades earlier appeared unrelated to a modern account. The details differed just enough to prevent easy comparison. And so, for a long time, they remained isolated, each one considered on its own, each one explained or set aside without reference to anything beyond it. But when these encounters are placed side by side, something begins to shift. The differences remain, but beneath them, a pattern starts to emerge, quiet and persistent. It is not obvious at first. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, through repetition that feels almost accidental, yet becomes difficult to ignore once seen. The sequence is often the same. An object appears without warning, entering observation in a way that feels sudden, almost intentional. There is no clear origin, no gradual approach, only presence where there was previously nothing. It remains visible just long enough to be recognized, often by those trained to notice what does not belong. Then, as attention focuses, as systems attempt to track and understand, it begins to move. The movement is where the pattern deepens. Not random motion, not drifting or erratic behavior, but something controlled. Acceleration that exceeds expected limits. Direction changes that occur without transition. Silence where sound would normally exist. These are not isolated descriptions. They repeat, across accounts separated by years, by location, by context. And yet, despite this presence, something else remains consistent. There is no direct interaction. The objects are seen, tracked, sometimes pursued, but never fully engaged. They do not respond in ways that suggest communication. They do not approach beyond a certain point. They remain just within the boundary of observation, then leave, often as suddenly as they arrived. It is as if they are aware of being seen, but not interested in being understood. This distance is part of the pattern, because it appears, again and again, regardless of who observes or where the encounter takes place. The same limits, the same boundaries, the same sense that something is being revealed, but only to a certain extent. Enough to be noticed, never enough to be fully examined. Over time, this repetition begins to feel deliberate. Not chaotic, not accidental, but structured. Each encounter following a sequence that, while not identical in detail, remains consistent in form. The same entry, the same display of behavior, the same withdrawal. It creates the impression of something being performed, not for a single observer, but across multiple instances, as if the event itself is part of a larger design. This realization changes the way the encounters are perceived. They are no longer isolated anomalies. They become fragments of something continuous, something that unfolds over time without revealing its full purpose. And within that continuity, a quiet question begins to take shape. If these events follow a pattern, then they are not simply reactions to circumstance. They are not spontaneous occurrences shaped by chance. They are something else entirely, something that exists independently of those who witness them, something that follows its own structure. This does not bring clarity, it deepens the mystery. Because repetition suggests intention, and intention suggests direction, not necessarily toward those observing, but toward something beyond them. A purpose that is not explained, not communicated, but expressed through consistency. The encounters begin to feel less like moments of discovery, and more like moments within an ongoing process. One that continues regardless of whether it is understood. One that repeats without variation in its fundamental form, as if it were following a script that has already been written. And that script does not change. It unfolds in the same way, again and again, across time that stretches far beyond any single observation. Each encounter adding to the pattern, reinforcing it, making it more visible, yet never fully revealing what lies behind it. And as that pattern becomes clearer, a deeper question begins to emerge. Not about what is being seen, but about what is guiding it. Because if these encounters are not random, if they follow a structure that remains consistent across every instance, then something is defining that structure. Something is determining how and when these moments occur. Which leads to a question that cannot be easily set aside. If the encounters follow a script, then who or what is writing it? When the encounters are examined closely, attention inevitably shifts from the moment itself to the objects at the center of it. Not what they might represent, not where they might originate, but what they do. Because within the descriptions provided by those who observed them, a pattern of behavior begins to emerge, one that is not dramatic in tone, but precise in detail and deeply difficult to explain. The accounts are consistent in a way that resists coincidence. Objects appear with no visible means of propulsion, hovering without drift, maintaining position as if unaffected by forces that would normally act upon anything within the atmosphere. Then, without warning, they move. Not gradually, not with acceleration that builds over time, but instantly, from stillness to motion, in a way that seems to bypass transition entirely. This is where the observations become difficult to reconcile, because movement, as it is understood, follows rules. Acceleration requires force. Direction changes require momentum to shift. Energy must be applied, and that energy produces effects that can be measured, detected, and understood. Yet within these accounts, those effects are absent. There is no visible exhaust, no sonic disturbance that aligns with the speed being described, no indication that the object is interacting with its environment in the expected way. And still, it moves. Not only forward, but in ways that suggest control beyond conventional limits. Sharp turns at velocities that should not allow for such precision. Sudden stops that do not result in visible deceleration. Transitions from one position to another that seem to occur faster than the surrounding systems can fully register. These are not exaggerated claims. They are repeated observations, recorded by individuals who are trained to recognize when something behaves outside the boundaries of what is known. The silence adds another layer to the anomaly. Even at speeds where sound should be unavoidable, there is often nothing. No engine noise, no disruption in the air that corresponds with the movement being observed. The object exists within the environment, yet does not seem to engage with it in the same way as anything built through known engineering. This creates a quiet tension. because the descriptions do not suggest something beyond observation. They suggest something beyond explanation. Not impossible, but incompatible with current understanding. And that distinction matters. It means the objects are not being dismissed. They are being acknowledged, but without a framework that can contain them. Over time, this leads to a subtle but unavoidable question. If these objects were created through known processes, then those processes have advanced far beyond what has been publicly revealed. Not incrementally, not through gradual innovation, but through a leap that bypasses the expected progression entirely. The gap between what is known and what is being observed becomes too wide to ignore. And if they were not created through those processes, then the question changes. It is no longer about advancement, but about origin. Not how this technology was developed, but where it came from, and what principles it follows. Because the behavior being described suggests a different relationship with motion, with energy, with space itself, one that does not align with the systems currently understood. This is where the dilemma begins to settle. Either the boundaries of technology are far broader than what is visible, extending into areas that have not been acknowledged, or something is operating outside those boundaries entirely. Neither possibility offers a simple resolution. Both require a reconsideration of what is assumed to be known. The tone of the observations never becomes dramatic. There is no need for emphasis beyond what has already been recorded. The consistency speaks for itself. The repetition across different encounters, across different observers, across different points in time, reinforces the same quiet conclusion. Something is present that behaves in a way that does not fit within the current model. And that presence does not explain itself. It does not reveal how it functions or why it appears. It simply continues to exist, to move, to follow the same patterns that have already begun to emerge, leaving behind a series of observations that cannot be dismissed, yet cannot be fully understood. This is where the boundary begins to shift. Not visibly, not suddenly, but in a way that becomes difficult to ignore. The limits of what is possible begin to feel less certain. The distance between known capability and observed behavior begins to close, not through explanation, but through the persistence of what has been seen. And as that uncertainty grows, another question begins to take shape, one that extends beyond observation itself. If this technology exists, if it has been seen and recorded in ways that cannot be explained, then it is not enough to ask what it is. It becomes necessary to ask whether anyone has tried to understand it, to study it, or perhaps even to recreate it, and what may have been discovered in the process that was never meant to be fully revealed. Once the behavior of these objects is considered carefully, another possibility begins to surface, one that does not present itself openly, but appears in fragments, scattered across records that never fully connect. It is not a claim that is confirmed, nor one that is entirely dismissed. It exists in a space between acknowledgement and absence, suggested rather than stated. The idea is simple, but difficult to ignore. If something has been observed repeatedly, if it has been tracked, studied, and documented with precision, then it would be natural for those with access to such information to move beyond observation, to examine not only what was seen, but what might be understood from it, to ask not just what it is, but how it works, and perhaps whether it could be used. This is where the narrative becomes more subtle. There are references, scattered and incomplete, to programs that seem to align with this line of thinking. They do not announce their purpose directly. Their descriptions are often vague, framed in general terms that suggest research, development, or analysis without specifying the subject in full. They appear within historical records for a time, attached to agencies or departments that have the capacity to explore advanced concepts. Then just as quietly, they fade. Their objectives remain unclear, but their existence leaves a trace. A project name that appears briefly, then disappears without conclusion. A line in a report that suggests materials were studied without indicating their origin. A mention of results that were achieved, but never explained. These are not complete stories. They are fragments, similar to the records that came before, each one hinting at something more complex than what is visible. The pattern is familiar. Something emerges, receives attention, then moves out of view before it can be fully understood. But this time, the implication is different. It is not about observation alone. It is about interaction. about the possibility that what was encountered may not have been left untouched, that it may have been recovered in some form. This is not presented as certainty. It does not need to be. The suggestion is enough to create a quiet tension, because it connects directly to the behavior that has already been described. If objects exist that move beyond known capability, and if those objects have been seen repeatedly, then the idea that attempts were made to study them more closely becomes difficult to dismiss. And within that idea, another layer begins to form. Some of these programs, based on the fragments that remain, do not simply end without result. They appear to have reached conclusions, or at least partial understanding, yet those conclusions are not shared. They do not enter the broader narrative of technological development. They remain isolated, contained within the same structures that limit access to the information itself. This creates a quiet but powerful implication. That progress may have occurred, but not in a way that becomes visible. That knowledge may have advanced, but only within a confined space, disconnected from public awareness. The absence of visible change does not necessarily indicate absence of development. It may indicate separation. And that separation raises a deeper question. Because if something was studied, if materials or technologies were examined, then their origin becomes more significant, not less. Understanding what something does is only part of the process. Understanding where it came from and why it exists in the form it does becomes even more important. This is where the uncertainty deepens. Because even if progress was made, even if certain principles were identified or partially replicated, there remains a fundamental difference between understanding and control. To observe a system is not to command it. To replicate an effect is not to possess its origin. There are limits to what can be achieved without fully comprehending the source. And those limits are rarely visible. They exist beneath the surface of what is known, shaping outcomes in ways that are not always apparent. A technology can be studied, even imitated to a degree, while still remaining fundamentally beyond reach. Its true nature unresolved, its origin unanswered. This leaves the narrative in a state of quiet tension, because the possibility remains that something was not only observed but examined, perhaps even used in ways that are not openly acknowledged. And if that is the case, then the story does not end with what has been seen. It extends backward, toward the source itself, because if something was recovered, studied, and partially understood, then it did not appear without origin. It came from somewhere, following the same patterns that have already begun to emerge, suggesting that the next step is not to question what was done with it, but to consider where it began, and what that origin might reveal about everything that has been seen so far. Once the possibility of study enters the narrative, attention shifts naturally to a quieter, more difficult question. Not how something behaves, not what it can do, but where it began. It seems like a simple place to look for answers. Origins often provide clarity, a starting point that explains everything that follows. And yet, in this case, the question does not resolve itself so easily. At first, the answer appears obvious. The vastness of space offers an almost infinite range of possibilities. Countless stars, distant systems, environments beyond imagination. It is easy to assume that anything unfamiliar must come from far away, from a place separated by distance so great that it explains the mystery through scale alone. The idea feels comfortable in its simplicity. If something is unknown, then it must belong to somewhere beyond reach. But this explanation carries its own limitations. Distance suggests travel. Travel suggests time. And time, as it is understood, imposes constraints. Movement across vast stretches of space requires processes that can be measured, understood, and eventually replicated. Yet nothing within the encounters or the observed behavior clearly supports this model. There are no signs of arrival, no evidence of long journeys, no indication that these objects follow the pathways expected of something that has crossed such immense distances. This is where the question begins to shift. Because if the origin cannot be explained through distance alone, then the framework itself may be incomplete. The assumption that something must come from far away begins to feel less certain, replaced by a quieter possibility that origin may not depend on distance at all. This idea does not present itself immediately. It unfolds slowly, through reflection rather than conclusion. The nature of perception becomes part of the consideration. What is seen is shaped by how it is interpreted, and interpretation relies on existing understanding. If that understanding is limited, then what is observed may not represent what actually exists, but only what can be recognized within those limits. This introduces a different kind of uncertainty, not about what is out there, but about how it is perceived. The possibility begins to form that origin may not be located in a distant place, but in a dimension of reality that does not align with conventional distance. Not somewhere far away, but somewhere that exists alongside, unseen not because it is hidden, but because it does not fit within the expected frame of observation. The tone of the question changes here. It becomes less about searching outward and more about reconsidering what is already present. The boundaries between known and unknown begin to feel less defined, as if they are shaped not by physical separation, but by perception itself. What is considered distant may not be distant in the way it appears. What is considered separate may not be separate at all. This does not provide an answer. It creates a deeper level of inquiry, because if origin is not tied to distance, then it cannot be measured in the same way. It cannot be located through simple coordinates or explained through travel alone. It becomes something more complex, something that requires a different way of thinking entirely. And within that shift, a subtle realization begins to take hold. The question of where something came from may not be about finding a location. It may be about understanding a relationship between what is observed and what is capable of observing it, between presence and perception, between reality as it is experienced and reality as it may actually exist. This realization does not close the gap. It widens it, because it suggests that the answer may not lie beyond, but within the limits of understanding itself. That what appears unknown may not be distant, but simply unrecognized. That origin, rather than being a point in space, may be something far more immediate and far more difficult to define. And as that thought settles, another question begins to emerge, one that reshapes everything that has come before. If origin cannot be explained through distance, then perhaps distance was never the correct way to think about it, leading toward a deeper exploration of whether the unknown exists not beyond reach, but within a reality that has always been present, waiting to be understood differently. When the question of origin loosens its hold on distance, another possibility begins to surface, quiet at first, almost easy to overlook. It does not arrive as a bold claim or a sudden conclusion. It emerges gradually, shaped by the inconsistencies already present, by the patterns that never quite fit within familiar explanations. What if the unknown was never traveling to us at all? The idea feels subtle, yet it carries a weight that changes everything that has been considered so far. Because if something does not arrive, then it must already be present. Not hidden in the sense of being concealed, but existing in a way that does not fully align with how reality is usually perceived. This possibility does not contradict the observations. In many ways, it aligns with them. The sudden appearances, the lack of detectable approach, the absence of clear departure paths, all of these details begin to take on a different meaning. Instead of suggesting movement across vast distances, they suggest something else entirely, a presence that shifts into visibility rather than entering from elsewhere, a transition rather than a journey. This is where the narrative begins to change its direction, not outward, but inward. Because if something exists alongside rather than beyond, then the question is no longer about where it came from. It becomes about how it exists without being fully seen, how something can share the same space yet remain outside ordinary awareness. The answer may not lie in concealment, but in perception. Human experience is shaped by limits. Vision captures only a narrow range of what exists. Sound is heard only within certain frequencies. Even the understanding of space is built on assumptions that feel complete, yet may only represent a portion of a much larger structure. What falls outside these limits does not disappear. It simply remains unrecognized. Within this framework, the behavior of these phenomena begins to feel less distant and more immediate. The way they appear without warning, the way they move without interacting with the environment in expected ways, the way they remain just beyond full engagement, all of it begins to resemble something that is not entering from elsewhere, but intersecting with what is already here. This is the moment where the realization begins to deepen, because if coexistence is possible, then separation becomes less certain. The boundary between what is known and what is unknown begins to blur. not because something has crossed into familiar space, but because it may have always shared that space without being recognized. This does not require a complete redefinition of reality. It requires a shift in perspective. The assumption that existence is singular, that reality operates within a single, continuous layer, begins to feel incomplete. The possibility emerges that there may be overlapping structures, different layers that occupy the same space without constant interaction. Not distant worlds, but parallel conditions of existence, each following its own rules, occasionally intersecting in ways that become visible. The encounters begin to fit differently within this view. They are no longer arrivals. They are moments of alignment, points where two conditions briefly overlap, allowing one to be perceived within the other. The lack of direct interaction becomes less mysterious, not as avoidance, but as limitation. The systems are not designed to engage fully, they are only capable of intersecting in certain ways. This creates a different kind of tension, because it suggests that the unknown is not something that visits and leaves, but something that remains, something that does not need to travel, because it is already present. Something that becomes visible only under specific conditions, then returns to a state that cannot be easily observed. The implications of this idea are difficult to ignore. If coexistence is real, then the mystery is not distant. It is immediate. It exists within the same environment, within the same space, separated not by distance, but by perception. And that means the encounters that have been recorded are not isolated intrusions. They are glimpses into something that continues to exist, regardless of whether it is seen. This realization does not resolve the question. It transforms it, because the focus shifts away from searching for something far beyond reach, and toward understanding something that may already be here. Not hidden in the traditional sense, but existing just outside the boundaries of recognition, present in a way that does not disrupt, yet does not fully reveal itself either. And within that shift, a deeper question begins to take shape. If something has always existed alongside, if it has been encountered without being fully recognized, then the mystery is no longer about where it is. It becomes about how often it has been there, unnoticed, moving within the same space, waiting not to be discovered, but to be seen differently, suggesting that what has been called unknown may not be distant at all, but something that has always been present, just beyond the edge of perception. When the idea of coexistence begins to settle, the past no longer appears as it once did. Events that seemed isolated, easily explained, or quietly dismissed begin to shift under a different light. Not because new evidence has emerged, but because the way those moments are understood has changed. Perception does not simply record reality, it interprets it. Every experience is filtered through expectation, shaped by what is already known. When something appears that does not fit within that structure, the mind does not immediately accept it as unfamiliar. Instead, it searches for the closest explanation, reshaping what was seen into something recognizable. This process happens quickly, often without awareness, and in doing so, it transforms the unknown into something that feels understood. This is where many encounters may have changed form. A light in the sky becomes an aircraft. A movement that defies expectation becomes a misjudgment of distance or speed. A moment of awareness becomes coincidence. Each explanation is reasonable, grounded in existing knowledge, and often correct. But within that process, something else can occur. The original experience may be altered, not intentionally, but naturally, as it is adjusted to fit what can be accepted. Over time, this creates a pattern of its own. Not a pattern of sightings, but a pattern of reinterpretation. Events that may have shared deeper similarities are separated by the explanations assigned to them. Each one placed into a different category, each one resolved independently, without connection to anything beyond it. This makes the encounters difficult to recognize for what they might have been, because they no longer appear as a consistent phenomenon. They appear as unrelated moments, each explained within its own context, each understood in isolation. The structure of perception itself prevents them from forming a larger pattern, even if that pattern exists beneath the surface. And yet, when viewed differently, certain details begin to align. Moments where something appeared without clear origin, then vanished without trace. Instances where movement did not match expectation, yet was dismissed as error. Situations where observers described a presence that could not be fully explained, then adjusted their accounts to fit within accepted boundaries. These are not rare. They are scattered throughout time, across locations, across experiences that were never connected to one another. Each one small, each one easily overlooked, yet together forming something that begins to feel familiar in a way that cannot be easily defined. This is where the quiet realization begins to emerge. Not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. That some encounters were never identified for what they were. That what was seen was not always understood in the moment, and that the explanations that followed may have obscured something more complex. Not intentionally, not through deception, but through the natural limits of perception itself. This does not suggest that every unexplained moment carries deeper meaning. It suggests that some might, and that the difference between what was recognized and what was not may not lie in the event itself, but in the ability to perceive it without forcing it into a familiar form. This creates a subtle shift in how contact is understood. It is no longer a singular event, something that happens clearly and undeniably. It becomes something quieter, more continuous. A presence that appears in fragments, sometimes seen, sometimes misunderstood, often passing without recognition. The boundary between contact and non-contact begins to blur. Because if something exists alongside, and if perception filters what can be recognized, then the absence of clear contact does not necessarily indicate absence of interaction. It may indicate that interaction has occurred in ways that were never fully understood. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It settles slowly, changing how past events are viewed, how present moments are interpreted, how future encounters might be recognized differently. The unknown does not feel distant anymore. It feels close, integrated into the same reality, moving quietly within it. And within that closeness, a deeper question begins to form. If contact has been ongoing, if it has occurred in ways that were not fully recognized or understood, then the silence surrounding it takes on a different meaning. It is no longer just the absence of acknowledgement. It becomes something more deliberate. Because if something has been happening all along, then the question is no longer whether it exists. It is why it has never been openly acknowledged, and what might be revealed if that acknowledgement were ever to fully emerge. By the time the question reaches this point, it no longer feels distant or abstract. It begins to press against something more immediate, something less comfortable. Not the unknown itself, but the effect it might have if it were fully understood. Because throughout history, information has not only been measured by its accuracy, but by its impact. Some knowledge changes everything. Not gradually, not in ways that can be easily absorbed, but all at once, reshaping how reality is perceived. When such information appears, it does not move freely. It is considered carefully, weighed not only for what it reveals, but for what it might disrupt. Belief systems, institutions, structures that rely on shared understanding, all of them depend on stability. And stability is fragile when confronted with something that cannot be easily integrated. This is where the possibility of fear begins to emerge. Not fear of the unknown itself, but fear of its consequences. What happens when something is revealed that cannot be explained within existing frameworks? What happens when the foundation of what is believed to be true begins to shift? These are not simple questions. They carry implications that extend beyond individuals, reaching into the systems that shape collective reality. The response to such moments is rarely immediate. It unfolds slowly, often in ways that are not visible from the outside. Information is examined, not only for its content, but for its effect. Consideration is given not only to whether it is true, but to whether it can be understood, accepted, and integrated without causing disruption that cannot be controlled. In this process, a quiet decision begins to take form. Not a single decision, but a series of small ones, to delay, to limit, to adjust how something is presented. Not necessarily to hide it completely, but to contain it within boundaries that reduce its impact. This does not require a coordinated effort in the way it is often imagined. It requires only a shared understanding that certain information carries weight beyond its immediate meaning, and that weight can be difficult to manage. Because truth, once introduced, cannot easily be confined. It changes perception, and perception shapes behavior. If something alters the way reality is understood, then it also alters how individuals and societies respond to that reality. The consequences are not always predictable. They can ripple outward, affecting areas that were never intended to be influenced. This is where the nature of secrecy begins to change. It no longer feels like concealment in the traditional sense. It begins to resemble containment. Not an attempt to eliminate information, but an attempt to control how and when it is encountered. To ensure that it does not arrive all at once, overwhelming the systems that rely on gradual change. This creates a different kind of tension, because the absence of information is no longer seen as a simple lack. It becomes a deliberate space, one that allows stability to remain intact. The silence surrounding certain subjects begins to feel less like avoidance and more like a boundary, one that is maintained, not because the truth is inherently dangerous, but because its impact might be. This idea settles slowly. It does not demand agreement. It invites reflection. The possibility that what has been withheld may not be hidden for the reasons that are often assumed. That the motivation may not be control in the direct sense, but concern over what cannot be easily predicted once something becomes widely known. And within that possibility, a deeper question begins to take shape. Because if information is being contained rather than concealed, then someone, somewhere, is making decisions about how that containment is maintained. Decisions about what can be revealed, what must remain limited, and what might never be fully shared. These decisions are rarely visible. They do not appear in clear statements or direct explanations. They exist within processes, within structures that manage information in ways that feel routine, yet carry deeper significance. And as the role of fear becomes more apparent, the focus begins to shift. Away from the information itself, and toward those who decide what happens to it. Because if the truth has the potential to reshape reality, then the question is no longer only about what that truth is. It becomes about who determines how much of it can be known, and why those limits were set in the first place. When information carries weight that extends beyond simple understanding, it rarely moves without guidance. Not guidance in the form of a single command, but through a process shaped by individuals who are placed in positions where decisions must be made carefully, often without clear outcomes. These are not moments of certainty. They are moments of consideration, where the implications of knowledge must be measured against the stability of everything surrounding it. The image of a single, defining decision is compelling. It suggests clarity, intention, a moment where everything changes at once. But reality tends to unfold differently, especially in environments where information is complex, uncertain, and potentially disruptive. Decisions are rarely made all at once. They are formed gradually, shaped by context, by pressure, by the need to respond without fully knowing what the response will lead to. In these situations, caution becomes natural, not because of fear alone, but because of responsibility. Those who are given access to sensitive knowledge are often tasked not only with understanding it, but with determining how it should be handled. And when the consequences are unclear, the safest choice is rarely immediate disclosure. It is often delay, limitation, or quiet management. This is where the process begins. A piece of information is received, examined, and held back, not indefinitely, but temporarily. Another piece arrives, raising similar questions, leading to similar decisions. Each moment feels isolated, each choice made within its own context. No single decision defines the outcome. Instead, they accumulate. Over time, something begins to take shape. Not a plan, not a coordinated effort, but a pattern of response. Information is consistently managed in the same way, not because it was designed to be, but because each individual decision followed the same logic. Caution leads to containment. Containment leads to separation. Separation leads to silence. And silence, once established, becomes easier to maintain. Because it no longer requires active enforcement, it becomes part of the structure itself. New information enters a system that already knows how to handle it. It follows the same path, guided by the same assumptions, shaped by decisions that were made long before. This is how secrecy can become self-sustaining. Not through constant control, but through continuity. The process repeats, not because it is forced, but because it has become the expected response. Individuals operating within the system do not need to question it each time. They act within it, reinforcing it without necessarily intending to. This creates a quiet but powerful effect. The origin of the secrecy becomes difficult to trace. There is no single moment to point to, no clear beginning. It exists as a series of choices, each one reasonable in isolation, yet together forming something much larger, something that persists, even as the individuals involved change over time. This continuity brings stability, but it also brings distance. Because once a system reaches this point, reversing it becomes more complex than maintaining it. Disclosure is no longer a single act. It is a disruption of a structure that has been reinforced repeatedly, across time, across decisions that were never intended to create a permanent condition, yet resulted in one. This is where the tension begins to deepen. Because the longer such a system exists, the more difficult it becomes to step outside of it. Each new piece of information adds weight to what has already been contained. Each decision reinforces the path that has been followed before, and the possibility of change begins to feel less immediate, more uncertain. Not impossible, but complicated. The individuals within this structure are not acting with complete knowledge of the whole. They see parts. They respond to what is in front of them, and in doing so, they contribute to a process that extends far beyond any single perspective. The system continues, not because it was designed to last, but because it was never fully interrupted. And within that realization, something becomes clear. The secrecy that surrounds this subject may not have been created in a single moment of intent. It may have emerged gradually, through decisions that felt necessary at the time, decisions that accumulated until they formed something that no longer required a central directive, a condition rather than a choice. And as that condition settles into place, another question begins to rise, one that cannot be easily avoided. If this structure continues, if it maintains itself through repetition and caution, then what happens when something changes? What happens when the information can no longer be contained within the boundaries that have held it for so long? Because if the system was built through countless small decisions, then the moment it begins to shift may not come from a single action either, but from something that gradually moves beyond control, bringing the question not of whether the truth exists, but of what happens when it can no longer be kept within the limits that once defined it. For a long time, the structure held. Information moved within controlled boundaries, decisions repeated themselves, and silence remained intact without needing to be reinforced. But no system exists without limits. Not because it fails suddenly, but because over time, the conditions around it begin to change. The first signs are often subtle. A document is released that would have remained classified before. A statement is made that acknowledges something once dismissed. A question that once received no response is now met with careful language, not confirming, but no longer denying. These shifts do not appear dramatic. They seem small, almost routine. Yet, when placed together, they begin to form a pattern of their own. Something is moving, not abruptly, not with clear intention, but in a way that suggests adjustment rather than resistance. The balance between what is held back and what is allowed forward begins to change. Not because the system has collapsed, but because maintaining it in its original form is no longer as stable as it once was. This change does not require a single decision. It emerges gradually, shaped by pressures that build over time. Public awareness grows, not through one event, but through accumulation. Information becomes more accessible, not through deliberate release alone, but through the way it can now be shared, compared, and examined. What was once contained within isolated systems begins to intersect with a wider audience, and within that intersection, something begins to shift. The silence becomes harder to maintain, not because it is broken directly, but because the space around it changes. Questions become more precise. Observations become more widely discussed. The fragments that once existed separately begin to align in ways that are difficult to ignore. The system that once relied on separation finds itself surrounded by connections that were not anticipated. This is where the nature of disclosure begins to evolve. It does not arrive as a single moment of revelation. It unfolds in stages, each one controlled, each one measured. Information is released, but in a way that does not overwhelm. Details are acknowledged, but without full explanation. The process remains careful, even as it begins to move. This creates a different kind of anticipation, because the truth, if it exists within this structure, is no longer entirely contained. It begins to surface, not as a complete picture, but as a series of glimpses, each one revealing something more than what was previously known, yet never enough to resolve the question entirely. This is not accidental. It suggests a transition. From containment to gradual exposure. From silence to controlled acknowledgement. The system does not disappear. It adapts. It begins to allow information to emerge in a way that can be managed, rather than held back indefinitely. And this raises a deeper realization. The truth may not be waiting to be discovered in the way it is often imagined. It may already be in the process of being revealed, not through a single announcement, but through a sequence of steps that guide how it is understood. This changes the nature of the mystery. It is no longer defined by absence. It becomes defined by timing, by how information is introduced, how it is framed, how it is allowed to move from uncertainty into recognition. The question shifts from whether something exists to how it is being presented. And within that shift, something becomes clear. The limits of secrecy are not fixed. They respond to the conditions around them. When those conditions change, the system must change as well. Not all at once, but gradually, in ways that maintain stability while allowing movement. This is where the moment begins to take shape. Not as a single event, but as a phase. A period where what was once hidden begins to enter awareness, step by step, fragment by fragment. The truth does not appear fully formed. It unfolds, guided by a process that seeks to balance revelation with control. And as that process continues, the question no longer remains the same. It is no longer about whether the truth exists, or even whether it has been hidden. It becomes about how far it has already come into view, and how much further it will move as the boundaries that once contained it begin to shift, opening the way for a deeper understanding of what it might mean once it is no longer held within those limits, and what humanity may face when the unknown is no longer distant, but fully recognized as part of its reality. There is no single moment when everything changes. No clear line that separates what was believed before from what is understood after. Instead, the shift begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if something has already begun to move long before it is fully noticed. At first, nothing feels different. The world appears the same, structured by familiar ideas, supported by assumptions that have remained stable for as long as anyone can remember. Reality, in this sense, feels fixed, something that exists independently of perception, something that does not require questioning. But beneath that surface, something subtle begins to unfold, a detail that does not fit as easily as it once did, a piece of information that lingers longer than expected, a moment of uncertainty that cannot be resolved as quickly as before. These are not dramatic events. They do not disrupt everything at once. They accumulate slowly, each one adding a small amount of pressure to a structure that was never designed to hold uncertainty for long. And as that pressure builds, something begins to change, not in the world itself, but in how it is experienced. Reality is not only what exists, it is also what is agreed upon. Shared understanding creates stability, allowing individuals and societies to move forward without needing to question every detail. But when that understanding begins to shift, even slightly, the effect can extend far beyond the original cause. A single inconsistency can lead to another. A question can lead to a reconsideration. And over time, what once felt certain begins to feel less fixed. This is how the change begins. Not with a single revelation, but with fragments. Each one small, each one manageable on its own, yet together forming something that cannot be easily ignored. The truth, whatever it may be, does not arrive fully formed. It reveals itself in parts, each one influencing how the next is perceived. This creates a gradual transformation. Because each fragment does more than add information. It changes context. What is known begins to adjust around what is newly understood. Previous assumptions are reconsidered, not discarded immediately, but held with less certainty. The framework of reality remains, but it becomes more flexible, more open to revision. This process is not always noticeable. It happens over time, often without a clear awareness of when it began. The shift is felt more than it is observed, present in the way questions are asked, in the way answers are received, in the way uncertainty is no longer dismissed as quickly as it once was. And within this gradual change, something important begins to emerge. The realization that discovery may not be a future event. It may already be in progress. Not as a single breakthrough, but as a continuous unfolding, where each piece of information moves the boundary of understanding slightly further. the unknown does not suddenly become known. It transitions, slowly, from one state to another, reshaping perception along the way. This creates a different kind of awareness, one that does not rely on definitive answers, but on the recognition that something is changing, that the structure of reality, as it is experienced, is not as fixed as it once seemed, that what is accepted today may be reinterpreted tomorrow, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. And this incompleteness is where the shift gains its momentum. Because once it is acknowledged, even quietly, it begins to influence everything that follows. New information is received differently. Old information is reconsidered. The boundaries between certainty and uncertainty become less rigid, allowing for possibilities that were previously dismissed. This is not instability. It is transition, a movement from one understanding to another, guided not by a single moment of realization, but by a series of changes that unfold over time. And as this transition continues, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to the way things were before, because something has already changed, even if it cannot be fully defined. And within that realization, a deeper question begins to take shape. Not about whether reality will shift, but about how much of it has already done so without being fully recognized, and what that means for those who continue to experience it as if nothing has changed, unaware that the process is already underway, moving quietly beneath the surface toward a point where it may no longer be possible to ignore, leading naturally to the question of how humanity will respond when the shift becomes impossible to overlook. When the edges of understanding begin to move, the change is not only external, it reaches inward, into the way the mind organizes reality itself. The unknown does not simply exist outside perception. It presses against it, asking to be interpreted, to be placed somewhere within a structure that was never designed to contain it. At first, the response is quiet. A hesitation, almost unnoticeable, a moment where something does not fit, yet is quickly adjusted, reshaped into something familiar. This is how the mind protects itself. It does not reject the unknown immediately. It reframes it, bringing it closer to what is already understood, allowing it to exist without causing disruption. But this process has limits. There are moments when something resists that adjustment, when the unknown cannot be easily translated into existing frameworks. When that happens, the mind begins to respond in different ways. Not all at once, not consciously, but through patterns that have repeated throughout human experience. One response is denial, not as a refusal to see, but as a way to preserve stability. If something cannot be placed within what is known, it can be set aside, treated as error, coincidence, or misunderstanding. This does not eliminate the experience. It simply prevents it from altering the larger structure of belief. Another response is adaptation. In this case, the mind begins to expand its framework, slowly integrating the new information into what it already understands. This process takes time. It requires adjustment, reconsideration, and often a willingness to accept uncertainty where certainty once existed. It does not happen immediately, but it allows for change without collapse. And then, there is transformation. A deeper shift, where the introduction of the unknown does not simply adjust the framework, but reshapes it entirely. This is rare, and it does not occur without resistance. Because transformation requires more than understanding. It requires acceptance of something that changes not only what is known, but how identity itself is formed. This is where the tension becomes most apparent. Throughout history, there have been moments where new knowledge altered the way humanity saw itself, not through force, but through realization. The understanding that what was once believed to be complete was only part of a larger structure. Each of these moments brought with it a period of uncertainty, where the mind struggled to reconcile what had been with what was becoming known. The pattern remains the same. Curiosity draws attention toward the unknown. Discovery introduces something new. And then, the mind must decide what to do with it. Not individually alone, but collectively, as shared understanding begins to shift. This is not a simple process, because understanding does not guarantee acceptance. A concept can be recognized, even proven, and still remain difficult to integrate. The mind resists what it cannot easily place, not out of unwillingness, but because it depends on coherence to function. When coherence is disrupted, The response is not always immediate adaptation. Sometimes it is hesitation, a pause where the new information exists but has not yet been fully absorbed, a state where the unknown is acknowledged but not embraced. This is where the greatest challenge emerges, not in discovering what is true, but in allowing that truth to reshape perception. This challenge does not affect only individuals. It extends to societies, to the collective frameworks that define reality on a larger scale. Beliefs are shared, reinforced, and stabilized through agreement. When those beliefs begin to shift, the effect is amplified, creating a tension between what is known and what is accepted. And within that tension, something important becomes clear. The unknown is not simply something to be discovered, it is something to be integrated. And integration requires more than evidence. It requires a readiness to accept change, to allow the structure of understanding to expand in ways that may feel unfamiliar. This is where the process slows. Not because the truth is unclear, but because acceptance takes time. The mind moves carefully, adjusting at a pace that allows stability to remain intact. The unknown does not become part of reality all at once. It becomes part of it gradually, as the framework that holds reality expands to include it. And as this process continues, another realization begins to take shape. If individuals struggle to integrate what challenges their understanding, then systems built on shared belief may face the same difficulty. The response to the unknown may not only be personal, it may be structural, shaped by institutions that must manage not just information, but the impact of that information on collective perception. Because if acceptance is uncertain at the level of the individual, then the question becomes even more complex at the level of society. And that leads to the next consideration. Not just how the human mind confronts the unknown, but how the systems that define reality respond when the unknown can no longer be held at a distance. As the strain reaches beyond individual understanding, it begins to touch the structures that hold that understanding in place. Systems do not exist apart from perception. They are built from it, reinforced by it, and maintained through shared agreement. Governments, scientific institutions, and global frameworks rely on a sense of stability that allows them to function without constant re-evaluation. Stability depends on predictability, the assumption that reality behaves in ways that can be measured, explained, and relied upon. This assumption allows systems to operate efficiently, to build knowledge over time, to create continuity. But when something enters that does not align with that predictability, the effect is not immediate collapse, it is pressure. At first, the response is subtle. A new piece of information is examined, placed within existing categories where possible. If it does not fit, it may be set aside, not rejected, but held at a distance. This allows the system to continue functioning without disruption, maintaining its structure while quietly acknowledging that something does not fully belong. This is not failure. It is preservation. Systems are designed to endure, and endurance often requires resistance to change that cannot be immediately integrated. But resistance is not permanent. Over time, as more information accumulates, as inconsistencies become more difficult to isolate, the pressure begins to build. And with that pressure, something begins to shift. Not visibly at first, not in ways that are openly acknowledged, but within the underlying structure itself, the way information is categorized begins to adjust. The boundaries of what is considered acceptable knowledge expand, not dramatically, but gradually. Concepts that were once excluded begin to appear at the edges of discussion. This is how adaptation begins. Not through sudden transformation, but through subtle realignment. The system does not abandon its foundation. It modifies it, just enough to accommodate what can no longer be ignored. This process is slow, often unnoticed by those outside of it, yet significant in its implications, because it suggests that change is already occurring. Not in response to a single event, but as part of an ongoing adjustment. The structure remains intact, but it is no longer exactly what it was. It has shifted, not enough to be obvious, but enough to allow new information to exist within it, without causing immediate disruption. This creates a different kind of tension, because while the system adapts, it does so without fully acknowledging the reason for that adaptation. The changes are presented as natural progress, as refinement, as the evolution of understanding, and in many ways, they are. But beneath that surface there may be another influence, something guiding the direction of that change. This possibility does not present itself clearly. It exists as a subtle undercurrent, felt rather than stated. The idea that adaptation may not be entirely reactive, but partially anticipatory. That systems are not only responding to what has already been revealed, but preparing for what may come next. This preparation does not require full disclosure. It requires only enough awareness to recognize that the existing structure may not be sufficient in its current form. That adjustments must be made, not all at once, but over time, allowing the system to evolve without appearing unstable. And this is where the transformation becomes most difficult to observe. Because it does not appear as disruption, it appears as continuity. The system continues to function, to produce knowledge, to maintain order, yet within that continuity, something is different. The boundaries have shifted, even if they have not been openly redefined. This raises a deeper question. If systems are already adapting, if they are quietly adjusting to accommodate something that has not been fully acknowledged, then what are they adapting for? What is the direction of this change? And what does it suggest about what may already be understood at levels that are not visible? The answer does not present itself directly. It remains within the structure, embedded in the way information moves, in the way narratives evolve, in the way certain ideas begin to emerge where they were once absent. The system does not announce its transformation. It allows it to unfold gradually, maintaining stability while shifting its foundation. And as this process continues, the distance between the hidden and the visible begins to narrow. Not enough to reveal everything, but enough to suggest that the change is not waiting to happen. It is already in progress. And within that realization, the focus begins to move again, away from structures and towards something more immediate, more personal. Because if systems are shifting in response to this hidden truth, then the effects of that shift may not be limited to institutions alone. They may already be present within everyday experience, shaping perception in ways that are only now beginning to be noticed, leading toward a deeper exploration of how this unseen presence may already be influencing the world in ways that feel ordinary, yet carry something far more significant beneath the surface. When the focus returns to the ordinary world, nothing appears different at first. The same routines, the same environments, the same quiet patterns of daily life continue without interruption. Yet something has changed, not in what is seen, but in how it is noticed. The shift that began in distant questions now settles into familiar spaces, altering the way even the smallest moments are perceived. Because the unknown does not always arrive as something dramatic. Sometimes, it exists within what feels entirely normal. A brief flicker of movement at the edge of vision, gone before it can be confirmed. A sound that seems out of place, then quickly fades into the background. A moment where something feels present, not in a defined way, but enough to create a pause, a hesitation that is difficult to explain. These experiences are not unusual. They are common, often dismissed without a second thought. And that dismissal is part of the pattern. Habit shapes perception, guiding attention toward what is expected and away from what is not. The mind filters constantly, removing details that do not fit within established understanding. This allows life to remain stable, predictable, free from constant uncertainty. But it also means that certain things may pass unnoticed, not because they are hidden, but because they are not recognized. This is where the possibility begins to take form. Not as a claim, but as a reconsideration. What if some of these moments were not as insignificant as they seemed? What if they carried details that were overlooked, not because they lacked meaning, but because they did not match what was expected? The idea does not demand acceptance. It simply invites attention, a closer look at what has always been there. Over time, this shift in perspective begins to reveal subtle consistencies. Not in a way that forms a clear pattern, but in a way that feels familiar. Instances that share a certain quality, a sense of presence that is difficult to define, yet difficult to ignore once it is noticed. Moments that were once isolated begin to feel connected, not through direct evidence, but through the way they are experienced. This does not turn the ordinary into something extraordinary. It changes the way the ordinary is understood. Because when attention adjusts, details that once seemed random begin to carry a different weight. A reflection that does not behave as expected. A movement that does not align with its surroundings. A brief awareness that lingers longer than it should. Each one small, each one easily explained on its own, yet together creating a quiet sense that something may be occurring beneath the surface of what is normally perceived. The boundary between known and unknown begins to soften, not disappearing, not collapsing, but becoming less defined. The two no longer feel separate. Instead, they appear to exist alongside each other, overlapping in ways that are not always obvious. What is familiar contains elements that are not fully understood. What is unknown is not entirely distant. This creates a calm, almost reflective tension, because it does not force a conclusion. It allows for possibility. The idea that something may have always been present, not in a way that disrupts, but in a way that integrates quietly into the environment. Not hidden, but unnoticed. Not separate, but unrecognized. And within this realization, personal experience begins to take on new meaning. Moments that once felt insignificant are reconsidered, not as evidence, but as part of a larger question. The sense that something may have been there, just beyond awareness, becomes more difficult to dismiss entirely. Not because it can be proven, but because it aligns with a pattern that has already begun to emerge. This does not bring certainty. It brings awareness. A subtle shift in how reality is experienced, where attention becomes more open, more willing to observe without immediately defining. The world remains the same, yet it feels slightly different, as if something within it has been noticed for the first time. And as that awareness deepens, another question begins to form. If something has always been present, if it has existed quietly within the same space, then its presence may not be entirely passive. It may not be limited to being observed. It may have its own patterns, its own forms of expression, its own way of interacting that has yet to be fully understood. Because if the signs were never hidden, only unnoticed, then the next step is not simply to see them. It is to consider whether they were ever meant to be understood as something more, suggesting that what appears silent may not be without intention, and that beneath the quiet presence of these moments, there may be something reaching outward in ways that have not yet been recognized, leading toward the deeper question of whether communication has already been attempted without ever being truly heard. If presence can exist without being recognized, then communication may follow the same pattern, not absent, not silent, but simply outside the range of what can be understood. Because communication is never just about sending a signal. It depends on something shared: language, symbols, patterns that both sides can interpret in the same way. Without that shared framework, even the clearest message can pass unnoticed, not because it was hidden, but because it could not be read. This possibility begins quietly. A signal appears, structured in a way that suggests intention, yet no meaning can be extracted from it. A pattern repeats, consistent and precise, but without context, it remains incomplete. An event unfolds in a way that feels deliberate, yet no response can be formed because the nature of what is being expressed is not understood. These moments are not new. They have appeared before, recorded and studied, then set aside when no explanation could be found. The absence of understanding does not erase the presence of structure, and structure is often the first sign of communication. But structure alone is not enough, because recognition depends on familiarity. Human language is built on shared meaning, developed over time through interaction and agreement. Symbols carry significance because they are understood collectively. Even the simplest message requires a context in which it can be interpreted. Without that context, the message remains incomplete, suspended in a space where it exists but cannot be accessed. This is where the tension begins to deepen, because some of the patterns that have been observed do not behave randomly. They repeat in ways that suggest design, signals that return at intervals, movements that follow sequences rather than chaos, variations that occur within boundaries, as if something is being adjusted, refined, or repeated with intention. These details are subtle, often dismissed because they do not lead to immediate understanding. But dismissal does not remove their significance. It only reflects the limits of interpretation. The possibility begins to take shape that meaning may have been present, not in a form that could be easily translated, but in a form that required a different kind of perception, a way of listening that was never developed, or perhaps never considered. Because communication is often assumed to follow certain rules: spoken language, written symbols, recognizable signals. When something falls outside those rules, it is not seen as communication at all. It becomes noise. and noise is rarely examined with the same attention as a message. This is where the quiet realization begins to emerge. The failure to understand does not mean nothing was said. It means that what was said could not be placed within a framework that allowed it to be recognized. The message may have been clear in its own structure, but inaccessible within the limits of human interpretation. This idea does not rely on certainty. It rests on possibility. The possibility that communication has already occurred, not once, but repeatedly, in forms that were observed but never decoded, that signals were received but not recognized as signals. That meaning existed, but remained just beyond reach, not because it was concealed, but because it required a perspective that was not available. This changes the nature of the silence. It is no longer empty. It becomes filled with potential, with fragments of something that may have been expressed without ever being understood. The absence of response does not confirm absence of communication. It suggests a gap between what is sent and what can be received. And that gap is not fixed. It can shift, expand, or narrow, depending on how perception evolves. What was once meaningless can become significant when viewed differently. What was once dismissed can gain importance when patterns begin to align. The process of understanding is not static. It moves, slowly, often without clear direction, until something begins to connect. But until that connection is made, the messages remain where they have always been, present, structured, and unanswered. This creates a sense of quiet unease, because it suggests that something may have reached out, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that required recognition. And that recognition may not have occurred, not because it was impossible, but because it was not yet within reach. And within that realization, another question begins to take shape. If communication may have been missed, if meaning may have been present but inaccessible, then what determines when and how it is understood? Whether it depends on human readiness, or something else entirely that defines the conditions under which contact can truly occur, leading toward a deeper exploration of whether the silence is a limitation of perception, or part of a structure that governs how and when connection becomes possible. When patterns repeat without clear explanation, they begin to suggest something deeper than coincidence. Not just behavior, but structure. A framework that shapes how events unfold, even when that framework is never directly observed. This is where the idea of rules begins to emerge, not as something defined, but as something implied. Because within the encounters, there are limits. Not absolute barriers, not complete absence, but consistent boundaries that seem to remain in place regardless of time or circumstance. Objects appear, but only within certain conditions. They are observed, but rarely approached beyond a specific point. Interaction remains indirect, as if something allows presence, but restricts engagement. At first, this can be interpreted as avoidance, a choice to remain distant, to observe without revealing too much. But when the pattern is examined more closely, that explanation begins to feel incomplete. Avoidance suggests intention directed toward the observer. Yet the behavior appears consistent, regardless of who is observing or where the encounter occurs. This consistency suggests something else. Not reaction, but adherence. The idea that these limits are not chosen in the moment, but followed as part of a structure that exists independently of the encounter itself. A set of conditions that define what can and cannot occur, shaping each event before it even begins. This possibility does not arrive as a clear answer. It unfolds gradually, through the repetition of boundaries that do not change. Distance remains constant. Interaction remains limited. Observation occurs, but never fully transitions into direct contact. The same pattern appears again and again, across different contexts, without variation in its fundamental form. And within that repetition, a subtle realization begins to take hold. The absence of direct contact may not be the result of reluctance or inability. It may be the result of constraint. Not imposed from the outside, but inherent within the system itself. A structure that governs how different forms of existence can interact, defining the limits of what is possible within that interaction. This idea carries a quiet weight, because it shifts the understanding of the encounters from isolated events to expressions of something larger, a framework that is not visible, yet consistently present. One that allows certain things to occur, while preventing others, not through force, but through limitation. The nature of these limitations remains unclear. They are not explained. They are not acknowledged. They can only be observed through the patterns they create. And those patterns suggest that whatever is being encountered operates within a set of conditions that are not determined by human expectation. This creates a different kind of mystery. Because it is no longer about what is being seen, but about what defines the conditions under which it can be seen. The focus shifts from the phenomenon itself to the structure that shapes it. And that structure remains hidden, not because it is deliberately concealed, but because it exists beyond direct observation. This is where the tone becomes more contemplative. The idea of rules, not as something imposed externally, but as part of the nature of reality itself. Boundaries that exist, whether they are understood or not, influencing interaction in ways that feel consistent, yet remain unexplained. The encounters do not break these boundaries, they follow them. And that consistency is what makes the idea difficult to dismiss. Because if there were no structure, variation would be expected. The behavior would change, adapt, respond differently over time. But instead, the same limits persist, suggesting that they are not arbitrary. They are part of something that does not change easily. This realization does not provide clarity. It introduces a deeper level of uncertainty. Because if there are rules, then they were not created within the context of the encounters themselves. They exist prior to them, shaping how those encounters can occur. And that leads to a question that extends beyond observation. Who or what established these conditions? And why do they exist in this form? The answers do not present themselves. They remain beyond reach, just as the boundaries themselves remain intact. But their presence suggests something significant. That interaction is not unrestricted. That contact, if it occurs, does so within limits that are not fully understood. And within that understanding, another question begins to emerge, quieter but more profound. If these rules exist, if they define how and when interaction can take place, then perhaps the mystery is not only about what is being encountered, it is about whether those encounters were ever meant to be fully understood at all, suggesting that the search for answers may itself exist within the boundaries of something far larger, where discovery is possible, but only to a certain extent, leading toward the final question of whether humanity was ever intended to reach beyond those limits, or if the truth has always existed just within view, but never entirely within reach. Up to this point, the story has moved through layers of silence, containment, and quiet control. The assumption has remained consistent that something exists, and that it has been kept out of reach. But as the pieces begin to settle, another possibility starts to emerge, one that does not contradict what has come before, but reframes it entirely. What if the truth was never hidden? Not concealed, not removed, not deliberately placed beyond reach? What if it has always been present, existing within the same reality, yet never fully recognized for what it is? This idea does not dismiss the patterns of secrecy. It suggests that those patterns may not be the only explanation. Because knowledge does not depend only on availability. It depends on recognition. Information can exist openly, yet remain unseen if it does not align with expectation. Meaning can be present, yet remain unnoticed if there is no framework to interpret it. This is not a failure of observation. It is a limitation of perception, shaped by what is considered possible at any given time. Throughout history, there have been moments where something was visible long before it was understood. Ideas that were dismissed, observations that were overlooked, patterns that were ignored because they did not fit within accepted models. Only later, when the framework of understanding expanded, did those same elements take on new meaning. What was once invisible became clear, not because it had changed, but because perception had. This is where the narrative begins to shift. Because if perception defines recognition, then the absence of understanding does not necessarily indicate absence of truth. It may indicate that the conditions required to interpret that truth were not yet in place, that the information existed but could not be fully processed within the limits of the time. This possibility carries a quiet weight. It suggests that concealment may not have been necessary, that the barrier between what is known and what is unknown may not have been created externally but internally. A boundary shaped by readiness rather than restriction. And within that boundary, something becomes clear. The patterns of silence, the fragments of information, the incomplete records, all of them may still be real, but they may not represent a fully hidden truth. They may represent something that was always partially visible, always present in pieces, yet never assembled into a complete understanding. This changes the nature of the mystery. Because it removes the need for a single point of concealment, the truth does not need to be locked away if it can exist in plain sight without being recognized. It does not need to be erased if it can remain unnoticed within the flow of ordinary experience. This is not a simple explanation. It is a more complex one, because it places responsibility not only on those who manage information, but on the limits of perception itself. It suggests that what has been considered hidden may actually be distributed, fragmented across moments, experiences, and observations that were never connected. And that connection depends on readiness. The ability to see something, not just as it appears, but as it might be. The willingness to question what feels complete, to allow for the possibility that something more exists within what is already known. This is where the tone becomes more introspective. The question turns inward, asking not what has been hidden, but what has been overlooked, not what has been denied, but what has been present without recognition. The idea of secrecy begins to dissolve, replaced by something less defined, yet more unsettling, because it suggests that the truth may not be distant. It may be close. Close enough to be seen, yet just beyond the point where it can be fully understood. Existing within the same reality, not separated by distance or concealment, but by the limits of what can be perceived at a given moment. And within that realization, another question begins to form. If perception creates the boundary, if readiness determines what can be understood, then the next step is not to search for hidden information. It is to understand how that readiness develops, how the mind expands its ability to recognize what was always there, and what it might take to reach a point where the truth, whatever it may be, can finally be seen not as something hidden, but as something that was always present, waiting for the moment when it could be understood. The shift does not arrive with noise or certainty. It unfolds quietly, almost unnoticed at first, as if something has been aligning beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. There is no sudden discovery, no single piece of evidence that forces everything into place. Instead, there is a gradual sense that what has already been seen begins to arrange itself differently. Fragments that once felt separate begin to connect. The encounters, the patterns, the silence, the structures that seemed incomplete on their own, now form something more cohesive. Not a clear answer, but a shape that feels consistent. The details do not change, yet their meaning begins to shift. What once appeared uncertain starts to feel intentional, not because it has been proven, but because it fits within a broader understanding that was not visible before. This is the nature of realization. It does not introduce something entirely new. It changes the way what already exists is understood. The information has been present all along, scattered across observations, records, and experiences that never fully aligned. Now, slowly, they begin to reflect one another, forming a pattern that feels less like coincidence and more like structure. The mind does not resist this immediately. It pauses, because something about the alignment feels natural. Even if it challenges what was previously accepted, the shift is not forced. It emerges from within the process of reflection itself, as if the understanding was always possible, waiting for the right conditions to take form. This creates a different kind of clarity. Not certainty, but coherence. The question of what has been hidden begins to lose its central focus. It becomes less about uncovering something concealed, and more about recognizing what has always been visible in a fragmented way. The emphasis moves from searching outward to observing inward, to noticing how perception organizes information and how that organization can change. This is where the realization deepens, because it suggests that the answer may not lie in discovering new evidence, but in reinterpreting what is already known. The fragments were never meaningless. They were incomplete. And incompleteness does not imply absence. It implies that something more was needed to connect them. That connection is not external. It is internal. A shift in perspective that allows the pieces to align without altering their original form. The same observations remain, the same patterns exist, but they are now understood within a different context. One that does not rely on the assumption that truth must be hidden in order to remain unknown. This realization does not resolve the mystery. It transforms it, because the focus moves away from what is missing and toward what has been overlooked. The absence of answers becomes less important than the presence of connections that were not previously recognized. The question changes, not in content, but in direction. It becomes quieter, more reflective, less about proving something and more about understanding how understanding itself develops. The process of discovery begins to feel less like a search for external confirmation and more like an unfolding of awareness, where meaning emerges gradually as perception adjusts. This creates a subtle but powerful shift in how the entire narrative is experienced. The unknown no longer feels entirely separate from what is known. It becomes part of the same structure, existing within it rather than beyond it. The boundaries that once defined the mystery begin to soften, allowing for the possibility that what seemed distant was never truly out of reach. And within that shift, something settles. Not an answer, but a sense of alignment. A recognition that the question itself may have been guiding the process, leading toward a perspective that could not be forced, only realized. The truth, whatever it may be, does not need to be uncovered all at once. It reveals itself through understanding, through the gradual connection of pieces that were always there. This realization does not arrive as a conclusion. It remains open. Because once perception changes, it continues to evolve. The connections that have formed are not fixed. They can deepen, expand, shift further as new information is considered within this broader context. The process does not end with understanding. It continues through it. And as that continuation becomes clear, the focus begins to move again. Not back to what has been hidden, but forward toward what this understanding means. Because if the answer was never missing, if it was only waiting to be seen differently, then the question is no longer about discovery. It is about what happens next, as this perspective continues to evolve and shape the way reality is experienced, leading toward a deeper exploration of what it means for humanity when the unknown is no longer separate, but part of a continuous process of understanding that has already begun to unfold. The moment of realization does not close the story, it opens it. What has shifted is not the existence of the unknown, but the way it is approached. The search no longer feels like a pursuit of something distant or hidden. It becomes something quieter, more continuous, shaped by the way understanding unfolds, rather than by the discovery of a final answer. There is no clear endpoint waiting ahead. No single moment where everything resolves into certainty. Instead, there is a path, one that extends forward without fully revealing where it leads. It is not defined by conclusions, but by movement. A process that continues, guided not by what is found, but by how it is interpreted. This changes the nature of the journey, because the focus is no longer on reaching a destination. It is on how the journey itself shapes perception. Each question leads to another, not because the answers are incomplete, but because understanding expands as it moves. What is known grows, but so does what remains beyond it. This is not uncertainty in the traditional sense. It is openness, a recognition that knowledge does not need to be fixed in order to be meaningful, that the act of questioning is not a sign of absence, but a sign of engagement. The unknown is not something to eliminate. It is something to explore, to understand in ways that do not require it to become fully defined. This perspective brings a different kind of calm, because it removes the pressure of resolution. The need to find a final answer begins to fade, replaced by a willingness to remain within the process. The mystery does not disappear. It becomes part of the experience, something that exists alongside understanding rather than opposing it. And within this shift, the role of curiosity becomes more important, not as a tool for solving the unknown, but as a way of engaging with it. Curiosity does not demand closure. It allows for continuation. It invites observation without forcing interpretation, allowing meaning to develop naturally over time. This suggests something deeper about the nature of the search itself, that it may not be separate from what is being sought. The possibility begins to emerge that the journey toward understanding is not leading to the truth in a direct way, but is part of the truth. That the process of questioning, observing, and reinterpreting is not simply a path toward an answer, but an expression of something larger. This idea does not resolve the mystery. It reframes it, because it suggests that the value of the search does not depend on its conclusion. It exists within the experience of exploration itself. The connections that are formed, the perspectives that shift, The awareness that deepens all of these become part of what is being uncovered. This leaves space for contemplation, not as a pause, but as an active part of understanding. The absence of a final answer does not create emptiness. It creates room. Room for thought, for reflection, for the possibility that meaning can exist without being fully defined. And within that space, the mystery feels different. Less like something to be solved, more like something to be understood over time. Something that reveals itself gradually, not through a single moment of discovery, but through a continuous process that never fully ends. This does not diminish its significance. It deepens it. Because what cannot be fully resolved continues to invite attention. It remains present, not as a problem, but as a presence. Something that exists within the same reality, shaping perception in ways that are not always visible, yet always felt. And as this understanding settles, the path ahead becomes clearer in its nature, even if not in its direction. It is not a path toward certainty. It is a path toward awareness, one that continues to unfold, shaped by how humanity chooses to engage with what it already knows, and how it remains open to what it has yet to fully understand. The mystery does not fade as the journey continues. It evolves, becoming part of a larger process that extends beyond simple answers, leading toward a final reflection, where everything that has been explored begins to converge into a deeper question about meaning itself, and what remains when the search is no longer about finding, but about understanding the experience of searching as something that has always been part of the truth itself. There are moments that pass so quickly they are almost forgotten, yet they leave behind a trace that does not fully disappear, a pause in the middle of something ordinary, a subtle shift in awareness that seems to arrive without cause. The instinct to look behind, even when there is nothing to see. These moments are familiar, experienced by many, yet rarely examined closely. They do not demand attention. They fade as quickly as they appear, absorbed into the rhythm of daily life. But when considered carefully, they reveal something that does not fit easily within simple explanation. Not fear, not imagination, but a quiet certainty that, for a brief instant, something was present. This feeling is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives softly, often in stillness, when the environment is calm and predictable. A room that feels empty, yet carries a subtle sense of presence. A space that appears unchanged, yet feels slightly different, as if something has shifted in a way that cannot be defined. The mind responds instinctively. It scans the surroundings, searching for confirmation, for something visible that can explain the sensation. When nothing is found, the feeling is dismissed. Not because it was proven false, but because it cannot be sustained without evidence. The moment passes, and the awareness dissolves. Yet the experience remains. Not clearly, not in detail, but as a memory of something that felt real, even if it could not be explained. And when these moments are considered together, across time, across different situations, they begin to form a pattern that is difficult to ignore entirely. A pattern of awareness without clear origin. This is where the narrative begins to shift inward. Because the focus is no longer on what is seen, but on what is felt. The possibility emerges that observation may not always be something external, something that can be detected through sight or sound. It may exist in a different form, one that interacts with perception itself rather than appearing within it. This idea does not rely on certainty. It rests on familiarity, the shared experience of sensing something without being able to define it, the recognition that awareness can arise without clear cause, yet still feel meaningful in the moment it occurs. These experiences are often dismissed because they do not fit within structured understanding, but their consistency suggests that they are not entirely random. They follow a quiet pattern, appearing in moments of stillness, fading when attention shifts, returning in different forms across different contexts. Always subtle, always brief, yet always carrying the same underlying quality, a sense of presence that does not fully resolve. This creates a different perspective on observation, not as something that happens occasionally, but as something that may be more constant than it appears, something that does not always reveal itself directly, but interacts with awareness in ways that are not easily measured. The possibility begins to form that observation may not require visibility, that it may exist as part of a larger interaction, one that does not depend on direct contact. a relationship between presence and perception, where awareness itself becomes the point of connection. This does not suggest a clear conclusion. It introduces a deeper level of uncertainty. Because if observation can occur without being seen, then the absence of visible evidence does not necessarily indicate absence of interaction. It may indicate that the interaction takes place in a way that is not fully understood. And within this idea, something begins to settle. Not as a definitive answer, but as a shift in perspective. The feeling of being observed is no longer dismissed as easily as before. It becomes something worth considering, not as proof, but as part of a larger question about how perception works and what it might be responding to. This does not create fear. It creates awareness, a subtle recognition that experience may extend beyond what is immediately visible. That presence may exist in forms that do not require direct confirmation, that the boundary between observer and observed may not be as fixed as it seems. And as this awareness deepens, another question begins to emerge. If the feeling of being observed is not entirely imagined, if it reflects something that has yet to be fully understood, then the interaction may not be one-sided. It may not be limited to being observed alone, because awareness itself may be part of something more, something that does not simply watch, but responds in ways that are not immediately visible, leading toward the possibility that observation is not a single direction, but part of a connection that moves both ways, shaping perception in ways that are only beginning to be noticed. If observation can exist without being seen, then it carries a quiet implication that is difficult to ignore. Awareness, once considered one-directional, begins to take on a different shape. Because in human experience, observation is rarely passive. The act of looking often changes what is being looked at. Attention alters behavior, sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that are immediately visible. This is something understood without needing explanation. A person who realizes they are being watched may adjust how they move, how they speak, how they present themselves. The awareness of observation creates a feedback loop, where the observer and the observed begin to influence one another. This interaction is not limited to conscious thought. It happens instinctively, shaping responses in ways that are not always fully recognized. Now, this principle begins to extend beyond familiar boundaries. Because if awareness is present in both directions, then observation may not be isolated. It may be part of an exchange. Not necessarily a direct communication, not something that can be clearly defined, but a relationship where attention itself becomes a form of interaction. This idea unfolds slowly. It does not require certainty to exist. It only requires the possibility that awareness is not confined to one side. That, whatever has been observed, may also possess a form of perception, one that does not operate within the same limits, yet still responds in its own way. The encounters begin to feel different within this perspective. The consistent distance, the lack of direct interaction, the patterns that remain unchanged regardless of circumstance, all of these details can be seen not only as behavior, but as response. Not to individuals specifically, but to the act of observation itself. This is where the tension begins to deepen. Because if something is aware of being observed, then it may also be aware of the intent behind that observation. The search for understanding, the effort to define and explain, becomes part of the interaction. The observer is no longer separate from the phenomenon. The act of searching becomes something that may be noticed. This is not a dramatic shift. It is a subtle one. The focus moves from what is being observed to the relationship that forms through observation. A relationship that may not be visible, yet influences how both sides exist within the same space. The observer seeks clarity. The observed remains just beyond it, maintaining a distance that feels consistent, almost intentional. And within that consistency, a new question begins to form. What if the act of searching itself changes the nature of what is being observed? Not in a direct way, not through immediate reaction, but through a process that unfolds over time. The attention directed toward the unknown may not go unnoticed. It may become part of a larger dynamic, one that shapes how and when certain things appear. This possibility does not suggest control. It suggests awareness. A recognition that interaction does not require physical contact. It can exist within perception itself, within the way attention is directed and received. The observer looks outward, seeking understanding. But that outward focus may also create a signal, something that exists not in words or actions, but in awareness itself. This creates a quiet sense of connection, not defined, not confirmed, but present in the way patterns continue to unfold. The consistency of encounters, the boundaries that remain intact, the absence of direct engagement, all of it begins to feel less like avoidance and more like balance. A system that maintains its structure while allowing limited interaction. And that interaction may be more complex than it first appears. Because if awareness is mutual, then the question of contact becomes more immediate. It is no longer about waiting for something to happen. It becomes about recognizing what may already be occurring in ways that are not fully understood. This realization does not bring clarity. It brings proximity. The unknown is no longer distant. It becomes something that exists within the same field of awareness, responding not through direct communication, but through patterns that reflect a deeper interaction. The boundaries remain, but they feel less absolute. And within that closeness, another question begins to emerge. If the act of searching is noticed, if awareness moves in both directions, then the relationship between observer and observed may not be neutral. It may carry influence, not in a way that is easily measured, but in a way that shapes perception over time. Because if something knows we are looking, then the interaction may already be more significant than it appears, and that leads to a deeper consideration. Not just whether awareness is shared, but whether that shared awareness has had an effect, subtle and gradual. On the way, humanity has developed its understanding of reality, suggesting that the influence of this interaction may not be recent, but something that has been unfolding quietly for far longer than it has been recognized. When awareness begins to feel mutual, the nature of influence becomes more difficult to define. It no longer depends on direct interaction or visible presence. It moves into a quieter space, where change can occur without being traced to a clear origin. This is where the idea becomes most subtle and perhaps most unsettling, because influence does not always announce itself. In human experience, many developments are accepted as natural progression. Ideas emerge, evolve, and spread. Behaviors shift over time, shaped by culture, environment, and shared understanding. These changes often appear organic, moving forward without needing a single point of origin. They feel like part of a continuous process, something that belongs entirely within human experience. But not all change is easy to trace. There are moments where something new appears, not gradually, but with a clarity that feels unexpected. Concepts that seem to arrive fully formed, insights that emerge without a clear path leading to them. These moments are often explained as creativity, intuition, or discovery, and in many cases, they are. Yet within this pattern, a question begins to take shape. What if some of these developments were not entirely self-contained, not controlled, not directed in any obvious way, but influenced, shaped by something that does not operate within visible interaction, yet still affects how ideas form and evolve? This does not require presence in a physical sense. It does not depend on direct communication. Influence can exist in ways that are subtle, almost indistinguishable from natural progression. This is where the narrative becomes more reflective, because the idea does not rely on evidence in the traditional sense. It relies on possibility, on the recognition that influence can occur without being seen. That systems, including human thought, can be affected by factors that are not immediately identifiable. This does not suggest control. It suggests interaction at a level that is not easily recognized. A shift in perception that occurs gradually. A pattern of development that feels natural, yet may carry elements that do not originate entirely from within. The distinction is difficult to define, and that difficulty is part of what allows the possibility to exist without being questioned. Over time, influence becomes invisible, not because it disappears, but because it becomes integrated. Once something is accepted as part of normal experience, it is no longer examined in the same way. It becomes part of the foundation, something that shapes thought without being noticed. This is where the idea gains its depth, because it suggests that influence does not need to be acknowledged to exist. It does not need to be recognized to have an effect. It can move quietly, shaping perception, guiding development in ways that feel entirely natural to those experiencing them. And within this framework, the boundary between independence and influence begins to soften. Not disappear, but become less certain. The assumption that all development originates internally becomes more difficult to hold without question. The possibility emerges that some aspects of understanding may have been shaped by factors that remain outside direct awareness. This does not diminish human experience. It expands it, because it introduces the idea that interaction may occur beyond what is consciously recognized, that the relationship between observer and observed may extend into areas that are not immediately visible, influencing not only what is seen, but how it is interpreted. This realization does not arrive with force. It settles gradually, allowing space for reflection rather than reaction. The implications are not immediate. They unfold over time, as the idea is considered within the context of everything that has already been explored. And within that consideration, something becomes clear. Humanity may not be as isolated in its development as it has believed, not in a way that removes agency, but in a way that suggests connection. A relationship that exists quietly, influencing without directing, present without being fully recognized. The world remains the same, yet the understanding of how it evolves begins to shift. And as that shift takes hold, the narrative moves toward its final stage. Because the question is no longer only about what has been hidden or how it has been perceived. It becomes about meaning, about what all of this suggests when considered as a whole. What it reveals about reality, about perception, and about the place of humanity within a structure that may be far more interconnected than it appears, leading into a final reflection where the mystery is no longer just something to be explored, but something to be understood in its fullest sense. The silence returns, but it is no longer the same. At the beginning, it felt empty, like a gap waiting to be filled, a space where something should have been but was not. Now, after everything that has been considered, that same silence carries weight. It feels layered, shaped by questions that have not been answered, yet have not faded either. It remains, but it no longer suggests absence. It suggests something else. A boundary that has not been crossed. Throughout the search, there has always been an expectation, quiet but persistent, that clarity would eventually emerge. That the fragments would align completely, that the unknown would resolve into something defined and understood. But as the journey unfolds, that expectation begins to shift. Not because the search has failed, but because it has revealed something about the nature of the question itself. Some questions do not resolve in the way they are asked. They extend beyond the frameworks used to define them, existing in a space where answers are not fixed points, but moving edges. The more they are explored, the more they reveal the limits of the structures used to contain them. This does not make them unanswerable. It makes them different. The silence reflects this difference. It is no longer something that needs to be filled. It becomes something that holds what cannot yet be defined. The absence of a clear conclusion does not diminish the significance of the search. It becomes part of it, shaping the way the unknown is understood. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It settles gradually, as the expectation of a final answer begins to loosen. The need for certainty softens, replaced by a quieter awareness that understanding does not always lead to resolution, that some truths may not exist in a form that can be fully captured, only approached from different angles. This changes the role of the search. It is no longer driven by the need to arrive at a single conclusion. It becomes a process of engagement, a way of moving through uncertainty without needing to eliminate it. The questions remain, but they feel different. Less urgent, more reflective, as if their purpose is not only to be answered, but to be experienced. This is where the silence gains its depth. It is no longer empty space between pieces of information. It becomes a space where meaning can exist without being fully defined. A place where possibility remains open, where understanding continues to evolve without closing into certainty. The idea of an answer begins to change. It is no longer something that exists at the end of the path, waiting to be discovered. It becomes something that is approached, gradually, without ever being fully reached. Not because it is impossible, but because it exists in a form that does not settle into a final state. This does not create frustration. It creates a different kind of calm. Because it removes the pressure to resolve everything at once. It allows the unknown to remain present without demanding that it become known in a complete and final way. The silence is no longer something to overcome. It becomes something to understand. And within that understanding, something shifts. The search for certainty begins to feel less central. The focus moves toward the experience itself, toward what has been revealed through the process of questioning, observing, and reflecting. The journey becomes meaningful not because it leads to an answer, but because it changes the way reality is perceived. This is the quiet twist that remains. The possibility that the search for certainty may have been misplaced, that the expectation of a final answer was never aligned with the nature of the mystery itself, that what has been sought may not exist as something that can be fully captured, only approached from within the limits of understanding. And as this idea settles, the silence transforms once more. It is no longer something that suggests something is missing. It becomes something that holds everything that cannot yet be explained. A space filled not with absence, but with possibility. And within that space, the narrative turns inward, not to find an answer, but to understand what this silence reveals about those who have been searching within it all along. As the silence settles into something fuller, attention turns, almost naturally, toward the one element that has been present throughout the entire search, yet rarely examined directly. Not the phenomena, not the records, not the patterns that seem to point outward, but the observer itself. Humanity. Because every question that has been asked, every pattern that has been noticed, every possibility that has been considered, has moved through a single lens. A way of seeing, shaped by curiosity, by fear, by the need to understand what lies beyond immediate experience. The search has always been directed outward, but it has also been revealing something inward at the same time. This becomes clearer as the journey slows. The need to find something external begins to soften, and in that space, another realization begins to take form. The unknown does not only exist beyond perception, it also exists within it. The way something is interpreted is influenced by the one who is interpreting it, shaped by expectations, beliefs, and the desire to make sense of what cannot easily be explained. Curiosity is part of this process. It drives the search forward, pushing beyond what is known, reaching toward what is not yet understood. It is not satisfied with surface explanations. It seeks depth, connection, meaning. But curiosity is not neutral. It carries intention, a direction shaped by the questions that are asked and the answers that are expected. Fear exists alongside it. Not always as something obvious, but as a quiet influence that shapes how far the search is allowed to go. The unknown carries uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges stability. The desire to understand is often balanced by the need to remain grounded, to keep reality within a structure that feels safe and coherent. And then, there is wonder, a sense of openness that allows the unknown to be approached without immediate judgment. Wonder does not demand answers. It allows for experience, for observation, for the possibility that not everything needs to be fully explained in order to be meaningful. These elements, curiosity, fear, wonder, form the lens through which the mystery has been viewed. And as that lens is examined, something begins to shift. The question of what exists beyond begins to feel less central than the question of how it is being perceived. The mystery itself remains, but its role changes. It becomes less about something external to be discovered, and more about what that discovery reveals about the one who is searching. This is where the reflection deepens. Because the search for alien contact, for hidden truth, for something beyond human understanding, is also a search for position. A way of asking where humanity exists within a larger structure, whether it is isolated or connected, whether it is central or part of something much broader. These are not only scientific questions, they are questions of identity. The desire to understand the unknown is tied to the desire to understand self, to find meaning within a reality that extends beyond immediate perception, to place existence within a context that feels complete. And within this process, the mystery begins to act as a mirror, not reflecting something distant, but something internal. The way questions are formed, the way answers are interpreted, the way uncertainty is handled, all of it reveals patterns within human thought itself. The search becomes less about what is found and more about what is revealed through the act of searching. This does not diminish the mystery. It expands it, because it suggests that the unknown is not separate from the observer. It interacts with perception, shaping it, influencing it in ways that are not always recognized. The boundary between what is out there and what is within begins to blur, not collapsing entirely, but becoming less defined. The realization is quiet, but significant. The mystery may not only be about what exists beyond reach, it may also be about what exists within the one who is reaching. The need to understand, the patterns of thought, the way meaning is constructed, all of these become part of what is being explored. And as this understanding settles, the search itself begins to feel different. Less like a pursuit of something external, and more like a process of reflection. A way of observing not only the unknown, but the observer. A continuous interaction between what is seen and how it is seen. This brings the narrative to a deeper point of clarity. Not a conclusion, but a recognition. That the search has always been revealing something more than it seemed. That every question carried with it an insight into the nature of perception itself. That the unknown, in all its complexity, has also been shaping the understanding of those who seek it. And as this reflection reaches its depth, one final question begins to emerge. If the mystery reveals as much about the observer as it does about the unknown, then what remains when the search is no longer focused on finding something beyond, but on understanding the experience of searching itself, and what that experience reveals about the nature of reality, perception, and the place of humanity within it? The story does not end here. It does not arrive at a final point where everything settles into clarity and remains unchanged. Instead, it softens. It becomes quieter, less defined, as if it is no longer trying to move forward in the way it once did. The search that began with questions and moved through patterns, possibilities, and reflections now rests in a different place. Not in answers, but in awareness. The unknown has not disappeared. It has not been resolved or fully revealed. It remains, just as it always has, existing alongside everything that is known. But something about it feels different now. Not because it has changed, but because the way it is experienced has shifted. It is no longer distant. It no longer feels like something that exists somewhere else, waiting to be found. It feels present, integrated into the same reality that is already understood. Not separate, not hidden, but part of a larger continuity that has always been there, even when it was not recognized. This realization does not demand attention. It settles gently, like a thought that no longer needs to be held tightly. The mystery does not disappear. It becomes part of the background, something that shapes perception without needing to be fully defined. The questions remain, but they feel different now. Less urgent, more reflective, as if their purpose has shifted from seeking answers to sustaining awareness. The search itself begins to change. It is no longer driven by the need to reach a conclusion. It becomes a process that continues without a clear end, moving quietly through observation, curiosity, and reflection. Each moment carries the potential for understanding, not as a final realization, but as part of an ongoing experience. This is where the story deepens, because it suggests that the relationship between humanity and the unknown is not temporary. It is not something that begins and ends with discovery. It is continuous, unfolding over time, shaping how reality is perceived in ways that do not always require recognition. The unknown does not need to reveal itself completely to have meaning. It exists within the same space as everything that is understood, influencing thought, guiding curiosity, and creating a sense of connection that does not depend on explanation. The absence of certainty does not weaken its presence. It allows it to remain open, to continue evolving without becoming fixed. This creates a sense of calm, not because everything has been resolved, but because the need for resolution has softened. The mystery is no longer something to overcome. It is something to experience, to observe, to allow to exist without forcing it into a final form. And within this calm, a final realization begins to take shape. The story has never been separate from the one experiencing it. Every question, every observation, every moment of uncertainty has been part of a larger process that connects the observer to what is being observed. The search was never only about finding something beyond reach. It was about engaging with something that has always been present, even when it could not be fully understood. This does not close the narrative. It opens it, because what continues from here is not a conclusion, but a continuation, a quiet unfolding that does not require attention to exist. The mystery remains, not as something distant, but as something that moves alongside awareness, shaping it in subtle ways. The silence remains as well, But it is no longer empty. It carries everything that has been explored, everything that has been considered, and everything that remains beyond understanding. It holds the space where the known and the unknown exist together, not in opposition, but in balance. And within that silence, the story continues. Not loudly, not clearly, but quietly, steadily, as it always has. There is no final transition, only continuation. The search does not end. It becomes part of something ongoing, something that does not need to be resolved to remain meaningful. The unknown stays present, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence that invites awareness. And in that presence, the story lives on, unfinished, unresolved, and quietly alive.